Thank you for being here this evening. For those of you who may be new, I'm Dave Alden. I'm the chair of Urban Chat, of which, Before You Grow, this evening's host is a committee. Great to have you here. We typically start off by recognizing dignitaries in the room. This evening, I know we have our mayor. We have, I think, 2 city council people. Isn't that right? Don't sit too close to each other. That could be a Brown Act violation. Watch it. Janice Gator Thompson and John Shribs, thanks for being here. Planning Commission, I don't see anybody here, but I think there are at least a couple of GPAC, General Plan Advisory Committee people here. Is that correct? Oh yeah, well, and me too. There's 2 of us. Okay. Anyway, thank you for coming out. Upcoming events for Urban Chat. We actually have a calendar that's a little light right now. We are going to have our monthly lunch, would be the 27th, so 2 weeks from tomorrow, Aquas Cafe. Last month we had, I think, 11 people around the table, good energetic conversation. Hopefully that energy will continue. Please come join us. Actually, please come join them. I will be on vacation, but actually, Dan, could you take charge of organizing that one? Thank you, appreciate it. We will skip Know Before You Grow on March 26th. I'll be out of town, just nothing's planned. We will have something on April 9. I just don't know what it is yet, but watch your email. Onward to our program. To begin with, even though I said a lot about cul-de-sac Tempe in my advertisement because people know the name, it was a way to get people out. But to be really clear, our speaker tonight worked for cul-de-sac Tempe. He was a consultant for cul-de-sac Tempe. Therefore, he's not speaking on behalf of cul-de-sac Tempe. He is speaking as an expert on car-free living. He is currently working for California Forever. I'm waiting for the boos or the cheers. I'm not sure which I hear. But again, he's not here on behalf of California Forever. He is, again, here as an expert. I assume many of you were like me when you first heard about the idea of car-free living in the middle of the Arizona desert. It's sort of like, what was that developer drinking that morning? Clearly, that makes no sense at all. That can never possibly happen. But when I saw that Opticos was involved as the planner, and I think in town we all know Opticos well, hey, maybe there's a shot. And somehow the project just kept moving ahead in ways I never would have expected. And now it exists. And now there are people living there happily. Anders was one of the people who helped make that happen. And if it could happen in Tempe, could it happen in Petaluma? It actually makes a hell of a lot more sense in Petaluma than it does in Tempe. So if they got there, what's wrong with us? I am thrilled that Anders and I have become connected. It was actually Strong Towns introduced us. Strong Towns would like to get more local groups going. They think Urban Chat's one of the coolest things ever. So and Anders has been pushing for the same thing. So they introduced us one day and the conversation's gone from there. I finally asked him to come speak to us and he readily agreed, for which I'm very appreciative. With that, he has been briefing me on how to pronounce his name. I have Anders right. I think I do. Anders Engnell. Oh, damn. Thank you for being here.
Good evening, everyone. Really appreciate you all coming out today. And thank you, Dave, for the connection, the invitation, the conversation. Really excited to be back in Northern California. I was in San Francisco at the start of the Cul-de-sac Tempe project, actually, living in Hayes Valley, Haight-Ashbury, eventually Glen Park to the south, right inside of some of the finest neighborhoods, I think, in the country. And I'm now a little further north, just east in Solano County, in a little city called Vacaville. And Fenella, my fiance, and I are just loving exploring and learning more about delightful places across Northern California. But I think Sonoma County is one of our favorites. So excited to be here in Petaluma tonight. What I'm going to be talking about is not 30 or 40 years of experience doing the same thing and kind of a proven model that I think is going to work everywhere. What I really hope these are conversation starters. Conversation starters about experiments, explorations, and some bold, radical things that people have tried elsewhere that you could take and retrofit in your own way for your own community that could be different by the block, different by the lot, different by the people behind it. But I think the theme that's going to be really important for all of this is what I have on the title here, that we are building for people, not machines. And that was the real ethos behind cul-de-sac. It's the ethos behind a lot of my work, going back to building public housing master plan communities in South Los Angeles, building orchards and urban farms in the Metro Detroit area, working in urban and greenfield development now in Northern California. And I want to start by just talking about that theme and why that's important and some of the inspirations, I think, for what became cul-de-sac Tempe. We're going to spend a healthy amount of time on cul-de-sac itself, as well as some other neighborhoods like that around the world. But I'd like to begin with sinking our teeth into what we've done for the last 80 years in the United States. My sections are going to be named by lyrics here, and I'll try not to explain them too much, but if you've heard Fix You by Coldplay, you know that line, when you get what you want, but not what you need. And I think what we found is, over the last 80 years, we have gotten exactly what we wanted. And I grew up experiencing the core of this in Metro Detroit. I grew up 10 minutes from the Chrysler World headquarters, 30 from GM, 45 from Ford. I grew up surrounded by stamping plants, actually, for General Motors. My grandfather, few college credits to his name, worked his way up the suppliers all the way to the assembly line of General Motors, got the stock options, the pension, the house in the suburbs, the whole shebang. And in the meantime, auto companies were ripping up rail around the country, retrofitting a variety of open spaces to look exactly like this, driving highways through neighborhoods, often low income, often minority neighborhoods, and doing quite a bit of work, sort of like a root canal of the entire nation to make this a paradise for the automobile. And congratulations, everyone, it's worked. Mission accomplished. You know, we made it to the moon and we turned America into the perfect environment for the automobile. I'm not going to overwhelm you with stats today, but I thought this one was fascinating. We have more registered cars in the country than adults. More registered cars than registered voters. And this isn't including all those junkers no longer on the registries, you know, laying around in some lot somewhere or back around. These are automobiles on the roads every single day. You think about all the space that consumes. You think about how much our world needs to be carved to fit that. It's a pretty astounding number. And you even just look at the way our world kind of works. I've heard this joke before, and I think I've had some more people repeat it to me recently, but if aliens came down from who knows what galaxy, they would think it was a world of cars with their servants kind of taking them around to different places, right? They would think the residents are these machines, and they've really trained those little biological organisms well to clean them, wash them, fuel them, take excellent care of them. But you see it from the way roads cover so much of our environment to the way our homes. It's a garage at the front door. You know, I thought these were great because show me a front door. Show me the entry place for people anywhere in this neighborhood. Our cars are front and center. And this could be a way of life. Absolutely. In a world without trade-offs, maybe this is glorious. And maybe the cars are absolutely happy about it. But everyone here has probably driven I-80 by Oakland at any time of day, any time of year. Enough said. How is that success, that incredible accomplishment of retrofitting our country around the vehicle, how's that working out for us? I think we're realizing now that there are some shortcomings to that sort of myopic development around just the automobile. No matter how many highways you build, no matter how many subdivisions you push to the edge of a metro, no matter how many parking spaces you build on surface lots or in parking garages, the demand is insatiable. And it never seems to work out in a very enjoyable way. You know, one thing that was funny about living in Phoenix for 4 years is I was watching as its highways were approaching the traffic that LA had when I had left Los Angeles and the San Francisco area. And then I ended up back in Los Angeles a few years after moving to Arizona, and it was even worse than it was before. I got to see from two different perspectives how traffic is almost always the inevitable outcome of building for cars. But it's not just traffic. There's a pretty incredible amount of people who die from automobile accidents, as they're called in the legal terms. Some of us might view them as murder, or at least manslaughter, desecration of life. But that is about 1/5 of all accidental deaths, as the government census categorizes them in the country. It's just about the plurality of ways people incidentally, end up leaving this life in a very tragic way. And it's wildly expensive. Automobile accidents, this is a little unclear, I should have clarified that, but automobile accidents in general cost Americans $500 billion. I know we're doing a lot of cutting in the government right now, right? Everyone's talking about that. $500 billion on the government budget, that's a deficit. That right there could do quite a bit of good work towards a surplus. But it's not even just accidents and traffic, it's land consumption. I don't know anyone who's ever told me that is just a beautiful parking lot. We need more of that in our city. And yet they take up so much gosh darn space. Excuse the Midwest swear word there. But it's incredible how much parking garages, parking lots, and other things consume. And when you read up a bit on the history of it, realize how many of our historic buildings and classic main streets we tore down to build a surface parking lot, you really understand why Joni Mitchell was quite upset when she sang, they paved paradise and put up a parking lot. And traffic, as we discussed, just keeps getting worse. We've got some brilliant minds. No one has quite figured out yet that traffic only gets worse when you keep building more and more roads, more and more subdivisions stretching to infinity. And that's where cul-de-sac really started with this question. Why are we doing this? Who are we really building for here? If we have control, we have autonomy. If we are humans who can choose who and what we design for, why are we doing it for cars? They don't live. There should be a slight amendment to this. Buying a car generates a lot of retail sales taxes. Car dealerships are very lucrative for cities, but the operation of the car, the storage of the car, all that stuff, they don't necessarily pay directly property or sales taxes themselves. And look, if Americans weren't spending money on gas, they'd spend it on something else. They'd be buying more groceries or buying nice gifts for their children and friends. It wouldn't have to go to gas. I've also just never seen any cars be truly philanthropic. I feel like they generally take up more space, are dangerous to be around. They're not exactly, the model citizen. But I think it's true when we say, if you look at a lot of our codes, building codes, engineering, street, zoning, if you just read them from a completely objective mindset, you'd think cars matter more than human lives. We seem to talk about them a lot more and how we regulate them, where they go, where they fit, how the buildings are fronted and designed, how the roads are laid out, how much parking is laid out for them, how wide lanes have to be. It's incredible how much they dominate that. And so what I would really like to hit home today, we'll see if I can hide this so it doesn't get in the way of my slides there. We all can try something different. That simple. We don't have to abide by the monarchy of the car any longer. We can give life a different go. I think one of the most beautiful things that ever happened in San Francisco was when the Great Highway fell along the north side of the city, right? An earthquake strikes, a highway topples, and instead of rebuilding it, we turn it into an amazing waterfront pier that I've had the pleasure of walking many a time from the Ferry Building all the way to Ghirardelli Square. It's gorgeous, one of the best public spaces in America, if not the world. And this is something that doesn't have to happen by accident because a natural disaster knocked out a highway. Do this deliberately. We can. And so what I'm going to walk through now is how you can go about doing just that. We retrofitted our country for cars. Let's turn the clock back. We don't need to invent anything new. And here's the interesting part. We don't even need to engineer it either. This can really be about something that's more than a feeling, an old song that we used to play. What if we resurrected a way of life long lost and just merged it with technology today? I'll admit, I'm not exactly sure how AI fits in with good urbanism. I haven't quite made that connection yet, so that will be out of the scope of this presentation. But we have scooters, we have bikes, we have e-bikes, we have all sorts of new mobility technologies. We have smart stations. We have all these different things that we can merge with a way of living that we spend a lot of money to go experience on vacation, right? You want to sit at that table right there, $3,000 minimum for a week, right? That is no cheap experience. How do we bring that home? One of the first inspirations for cul-de-sac Tempe, something we look to very closely, were the superblocks in Barcelona, or Barcelona, if you've spent a good time speaking Catalan or Spanish on the eastern side of Spain. And there's one gentleman, Salvador Rueda, who I'd be remiss not to mention, because he spent 30 years preparing Barcelona for these superblocks, which, as you can see here, were pedestrianized takeovers of city intersections. So imagine, first in D, but shut down to cars, and you move some planters and some benches and big concrete balls, and then just let people at it. That's effectively what they did with many of the super blocks inside of Barcelona. But it took 30 years of work by Salvador Rueda, testing, trying, experimenting, before they were able to do this. This is a very simple thing to build. You could do this with some lanky, strong teenagers in a weekend. What's difficult is the political and cultural will, the political and cultural technologies and abilities to actually pull this off. If you've spent any time around a dais, in front of, behind, and you've been around public comment, you know how hard this is to get through the public process. It's not hard to build. It's hard to change the way we live to get to that point. But Barcelona's been doing it for a long time. And they're using that momentum that's taken decades to build to create a whole new urban fabric in l'Eixample within Barcelona itself. It's a district in the center of the city, originally designed by an amazing civil engineer, Ildefons Cerda. After Barcelona was freed by Spanish king, I believe it was sometime around the mid-1800s. For a long time, they were a rebel city. And I think it was a King Philip XV or something, don't quote me on that. It was sort of like, we're going to keep you in these walls for a while. It's been causing a little too much trouble. Population density skyrocketed, people were falling over themselves. If you go to Old Town Barcelona, you'll actually see how some of the thin streets are 3 people wide. They were building over those. And so the walls come down, the mid-1800s, they hold a competition for the expansion zone of the city. And a civil engineer named Salvador Rueda laid out these blocks here for trains and people and pedestrians. But he did that in the 1860s. So 30 years later, a little invention comes along, and then it's industrialized by Ford, and then before you know it, l'Eixample becomes a kingdom for cars. And now Barcelona is taking that back. The green zones here are pedestrian environments, and the white are where cars can travel. So you'll notice, cars can intersect a lot of the green areas. The red intersections are the ones where they have pedestrianized experiences. Most of the streets here are still white. Cars can cross most of them. They've taken a small fraction of those streets back to create places for people to thrive. And the fun thing about this, if you're an elected, if you're a planner or an engineer or a builder, these are a lot more fun to plan and build than just some old boring roads with street parking. In this kind of world, where you're converting spaces back into places for people, you're not just worried about ramming a car through it as fast as possible. You get to play with it. One of the most exciting things for me about the super blocks is the way that they all take on a different personality. In a Poblano or the Santa Antony or others, they'll try parks. They'll try just open seating. They'll try a stage. They get to experiment and see what people in that neighborhood like. Who can do that with a street? Cars don't have preferences like that. They're just constantly going. There's nothing really interesting about a road after cars take it over. They can do something completely different in Barcelona. And so, with some folks who were crazy enough to ask that question, inspired by examples they'd seen around the world, Ryan Johnson, who used to be on the founding team of a company called Open Door, that works as a transaction intermediary for homes, and a good friend of mine and a roommate of his, Jeff Behrens, decided to build something different. And they said, why don't we, knowing that pedestrianized environments are fantastic, that living without a car can be a great thing if you do it right, why don't we try to build a neighborhood for that? Let's build a whole community at the right scale. You could have a grocery store, a coffee shop. You could have micro retail around. We could make sure it's nicely connected to transit. You could offer subsidies for people to use e-bikes and Lyft and Uber and all these other things. And hey, autonomous vehicles around the corner. What if we found a way to fit those into the fabric too? That was the pitch I heard in 2018. And just 5 years later, despite COVID and supply chain crunches, and some of the wildest construction difficulties that we've seen in a century, Cul-de-sac Tempe opened in Arizona with 0 parking spaces set aside for residents. Every single resident is actually in the lease required to sign and say, I will not own a car and park it within a 1/10 of a mile of this neighborhood. It's part of the lease. And so the residents of this neighborhood living in these Mediterranean style buildings around this plaza with micro retail nestled into the frontages there, they live by light rail, where there's a lovely station just north of this community. They live by bike and scooter and rental cars. We call it car free, but that's another way of saying private car ownership free. People still get to use Waymos and Lyfts and Ubers and little rental cars, but they need so much less parking because they don't all own a private car. You can take the money you would have spent on a structured parking garage, which for this neighborhood would have been about $20 million under regular parking code, and you can dedicate that space and a lot of that cash to great retail, an incredible gym. This right here is a 2-story gym, one of the finest in the area, with an incredible layout of equipment, great windows overlooking the retail and the plaza, and the spaces beyond. Those are the kind of things that you can deliver when you're not building a world around cars. So I was very lucky to be the director of construction and planning at Cul-de-sac Tempe for 4 years. I was with the company for about 5 years. At the start, I was kind of a consultant intern of sorts. But I stuck around long enough and took enough bonks against the head that they're like, hey, you can kind of manage some of this stuff. So I was a part of the team that led the design, planning, and then building of courtyards just like this. All of the neighborhoods, we call them pods, are arranged around 3-story white Mediterranean buildings with tons of parking spaces for bikes at the edges and little pathways moving through. And every single little pod of maybe 20, 30 apartments would have this center courtyard. It's a gathering space for family and friends. What's very interesting about this courtyard architecture is it's impossible with cars. Driveways, fire lanes, parking garages literally make this impossible. You can play around with it if you get the right square. You can put the courtyard in the middle and kind of fit the roads around, but it's a little clunky. It's not as intimate. But this is the way we used to live. When we were studying examples of great human communities all over the world, we kept coming across this example of a courtyard community in Latin America, in Japan, Northern Africa. In fact, our urban plan for this community looks a lot like a plan that an architect named Hassan Fafi laid out for an Egyptian community called New Gourna. There's the commercial area, the residential communities with courtyards. These were just, for us as humans, fantastic places to live because the family could all gather in one common zone. You could have folks who are able on the ground, on the second floors or third floors. You'd have folks who are elderly or with young children on the ground. You could rotate in and out amongst the units. You'd have your own private space. You'd have your own semi-private area, and you'd kind of have some public grounds. I was actually just talking with my aunt today, and she was talking about our grandparents moving into a home nearby them. And she was like, we're neighbors. We're not sharing the same home. We're neighbors. We live near each other. We have the public spaces where we can gather, but we have our own private spaces too. And these courtyard communities were so good for that. But we can't build them when all we're thinking about are 4 wheels and an engine. I had to ask Vanilla if this sentence makes any sense. My apologies if it doesn't quite land. But the way we wanted to think about it is that this is something very similar to what we've done before. Rhymes with the past. But it's something that works with the modern day, that harmonizes with modern mobility technologies, with the way that we want to live and work. You didn't need rental cars back then. You may have not had the massive train systems either. You definitely didn't have Waymo autonomous vehicles coming to pick you up without a driver at the front door of your neighborhood. But that's the way Cul-de-sac Tempe works now. And so we wanted to have the opportunity to build from scratch a community for all those things, for micro retail, for events, for pedestrian environments, for modern mobility. What's kind of funny is we actually thought we missed the AV, the autonomous vehicle boat, back in about 2017, 2018. Everyone was talking. In 5 years, all the cars on the road will be driverless. No one will need to be behind us, a wheel anymore. Didn't happen. Kind of died off after COVID. And then before you know it, in 2023, Waymo is announcing that they're expanding autonomous vehicles into this territory. And we ended up, we actually designed some of the street parking along the north side of the community for autonomous vehicles. Thought nothing of it for a bit, like, maybe down the road, 10 years from now they'll come about. And then before we knew it, Waymos were pulling up to the neighborhood. And one of our really exciting leasing experiences actually was having people come by the restaurant and just take a tour of the surrounding neighborhood in a Waymo, just a loop. Wouldn't go anywhere, just ride around without a driver throughout the area for a little bit and then come on back. This is in San Francisco now. I don't know when it's coming to Petaluma, but it's one of those exciting things that we can talk about bringing classical urbanism and modern mobility technology together with. I do want to be clear, as you can imagine, this is not all sunshines and roses. The path from these initial renderings to certificates of occupancies was hard. It wound all around, up and down, getting hit by COVID and supply chain crises, and all the other construction madness of the post-COVID world led to a lot of unique problems to solve all the time. It was intensive, it was difficult. It was not for the faint of heart. But what's, I think, more exciting than anything else is when you can actually experience these places coming to life. When I've stayed in the neighborhood and seen residents and families enjoying the courtyards together, walking to the micro retail just outside their little pod, stopping by the restaurant at the corner, or using the grocery. It's a Korean style grocery that's there right now. There are a few things more rewarding than that. When you realize you've unlocked a way of living for people in the United States that we have actually lost outside of a few select areas that are way too expensive, that we've lost and have to go through a long road to bring it back. But what's exciting now is this isn't just cul-de-sac Tempe. This isn't just some select districts in Boston or San Francisco and elsewhere. This is really becoming a global movement. I think in many ways across the world, we're wanting to bring back design that's just for us. I think we all kind of got a little too much into hey, this invention is great. Why don't we orchestrate our entire lives around it? We're seeing, and I'd love to see more of this, a bit of a one-upping happening between different places. So Utrecht is actually designing a 60-acre car-free district called myriad. And they have an even better tagline than I could have thought of. This is a community for bikers, not bumpers. But you'll notice there are some shared elements between cul-de-sac Tempe and myriad. And I think that you'll find these shared elements between any community you design around people. You have differing heights to allow natural light in through different areas. You have zones that are commercial focused. You have zones that are just residential focused. You have courtyards. You have different kinds of streets that arrange and connect the community to the world around it. You have the more intensive movement streets where you'll have more bikers and pedestrians. You have the softer kind of secondary routes that get you from one place to another within the district. And then you have the little internal networks, the kind of pedestrian and walking your bike paths between. I think what we're going to see is across the world, a lot more communities just like this designed around people are going to start popping up as we figure out this is a really good way of living. That's entirely possible. Truth be told, this has been happening under the radar for a long time. If you've ever been to Times Square, heard about it, this was actually one of the first places that was converted to a car-free district. It was just kind of accepted, I think, that Times Square, of course, it didn't have people there. That's where we dropped the ball. How can you do that if there's a bunch of cars in the middle of the road? But this is one of the first districts in New York City under the Bloomberg administration with Janet Sadiq Khan, the author of Street Fight, an absolutely amazing book if you haven't read it. It was one of the first places that said, hey, we can create an amazing environment for people. And it doesn't have to be chock full of aluminum and gas guzzling engines. There have been other places that have been doing it for some time too. I don't know if anyone here has been to Santa Monica, but the 3rd Street Promenade is marvelous. And it took them a couple decades to reach the point it is now. They actually tried a few different iterations of a pedestrianized environment in the 70s and 80s. One interesting thing they found is they actually hadn't quite designed it in a way that works for people. They had all flush roads and people were wandering through it like a park, right? We kind of have this human instinct. We need soft edges. We need a little bit of direction. We don't like wide open spaces with, or at least not all of us do, wide open spaces like a savanna where a predator could just pick us off if we didn't know what was happening. So they actually created, you can see, they created a little curb. They created a sense of edging. They put trees and nice facades over the sidewalk. After that redesign, things took off in 1989. They found the right formula to make it comfortable and inviting for people. And it's become one of the best environments for shopping and retail in all of Southern California. I've personally loved it for a long time. But there are a lot of haters of this kind of thing. This is one of my favorites. It's a little unfair. I actually pulled this from an auto news magazine. So of course it's a little sassy, but I thought it was just comical. Car-free cul-de-sac Tempe is proof the world is full of people willing to make bad decisions. But you got to think, you know, a community where your kids can walk safely to school, where you can be just a few steps from a grocery store, where you can park your bike in peace and take it to work every day. Doesn't seem like bad decisions to me. But, you know, there are some people that think, you know, contractually forbidding you from parking a vehicle on site is the most horrifying thing you could write. So the beauty, and this is actually what I told people, there's some conspiracy theories that get wrapped around walkable communities. You may have heard of a few. What I've told people, this is actually about maximum freedom. You're telling me in the land of the free and the home of the brave, you only have one option for navigating your world, and that's a car. What kind of competitive free market is that where I have very few ways I can navigate my environment? Come on. Flip it on them. And so the question really is not, do you want to build cul-de-sac Tempe or Merwede, or do you have the capacity to have a Times Square? It's, do you want to experiment with pockets of safety, fun, and community in your city? This isn't going to happen overnight. I don't think it even should happen in chunks. It should happen bit by bit, day by day, year by year, little bits of this movement spreading in the right parts of your city, one to the other. We even saw it. They've been working on pedestrian environments in Barcelona for 50 years now, roughly, with different leaders along the way. And the super blocks are still just a small portion of l'Eixample inside that city. This takes time, but even just having a few of these in an environment can be great. Also needed Fenella's help. She's a musician, singer, songwriter. Needed her help on this one. But this last section, I think Fleetwood Mac expresses better than anyone else could. I've been afraid of changing because I built my life around you. And that's, I think, the hardest question to answer. How do we change what we've spent 80 years designing, engineering, building? I try to be very careful when I talk to people about these things, because there have been a few times where I've realized, as I'm absolutely railing the world we've built, I'm standing in front of a transportation planner who's done this his whole career. And I'm like, oh, okay, let's start off on a different foot. You did a great job with your work. We just need to do something different now. But it's a very delicate thing. There are reasons. We have a lot of codes, fire code, a lot of good reasons to build places resilient from fire. A lot of good reasons to have street codes that mandate safety standards. What we need to do is be very deliberate and say, we did some great things, maybe we went up too. We'll pull it back. For instance, let's not call trees on the side of a road fixed hazardous objects. We realize that if a car hits them, that's a problem. But what if we design streets that are so safe and slow, we're not worried about cars screaming off the side and hitting pedestrians or a tree? Maybe we rethink that. We're not trying to overhaul it. We're trying to reclaim a little bit of the past when we design for humans. And all we really need are some small tweaks. We don't need to burn the whole thing down and start over. Some small tweaks could go a really long way. And I think we're seeing that question asked all across the country right now. Whether we're building something entirely new, like cul-de-sac Tempe, or just retrofitting what we have, like Times Square or the super blocks, there are layers of things we need to change. Legacies, codes, regulations, even just traffic counts and parking formulas. The parking study that went into cul-de-sac Tempe took quite a bit of work to get those numbers in the right spot to understand how to predict modalities. We were like, how do we actually predict how many people will use light rail or bikes or other things like that? We're only used to predicting how many people will use cars. If your model only inserts people here and, you know, outputs cars in motion there, how are you going to know where bikes and trains and everything else fit into that equation? There's actually a lot of math that we need to change, not just zoning codes. But I think the best way to start, and this is what we saw at cul-de-sac Tempe, it's what I've seen in a lot of different places, you can cast the vision first. You can have conversations like this. You can share projects and renderings and ideas. My mom is hilarious because she's always sending me things from around the world. She's actually my best research agent. I'm always getting little snippets. Oh, this thing is happening over here in the Netherlands now. Look at that. Oh, look at this small town in Northeast America is doing this thing. It's just like what you're working on. This is actually very helpful. But just casting that vision can be the start. And this was actually how we got cul-de-sac Tempe in front of the city council, the mayor, and the other people there. We didn't start with, here's a project of so many units and so many details that'll deliver like this. We shared renderings and said, We want to bring you great retail, great open space, a lot of flexibility in how your residents get around, beautiful architecture. And here's what we need. We need parking requirements for residents set to 0. We need some shifting in the architectural code. We need a little bit of flexibility, even on fire code, so that we can use wall-mounted ladder systems to access rooftops instead of having to scream a massive truck down the middle of our neighborhood so its ladders can get to all the rooftops of all the buildings. We needed tweaks to the code to make this possible, but we didn't start with tweaks. If we did, we would have been shut down. We started with a vision for what something could be. And I've generally found in a lot of conversations and being yelled at a fair amount of times and taken down a lot of conspiracy theory lanes that it's good to frame things from the positive first. It's not, we don't want cars. We're going to take away your parking, Mr. Small Business, trying to survive. It's, we want to create neighborhoods where there's less traffic, great retail, and safe places for kids. And I don't even say eliminate parking. I say right size parking. Right size parking in downtown New York means no parking. Right size parking in Petaluma may be 1 to 2 parking spaces per unit. I'm not entirely sure. That's for the community to decide. But when you start having the conversation about right sizing parking, what you unlock is what's even behind parking codes. And when you open that closet door, ladies and gentlemen, there is nothing behind it. I haven't seen data or calculations or a lot of rationale behind how many parking spaces we set aside per unit. I think it's a cultural attitude, actually. I think it's people sort of thinking, well, if I was living there, or if I was at that business, this would kind of make sense. Generally, by a rule of thumb, this could work. So let's just ask the questions. Let's ask, what's the right size of parking for this business, for this residence, for this area of town? And that can take a really long way. I've already seen this in Petaluma. I think you're doing a great job with the 5th Street Greenway. I know you've got stuff going on D Street and other places. Tactical urbanism is a great way to just slyly, steadily introduce little things. Crosswalks for pedestrians are actually quite nice. A little bit of paint makes a big difference. Just adding some bulb outs, which I think you've been doing quite a bit of around here. These little projects are the perfect environment to start. I've been thinking a lot more of the urbanism work I do is like the regrowth of a forest, where I'm not just going to immediately plant a 30-foot tall oak tree in grasslands. There's too much sun around, the soil nutrients aren't right. You need to start small. You need to start with the little things. The forest gradually accumulates. It's those small projects that add up over time. And as those projects add up, as you explore different ideas and approaches, you can just give yourself the freedom to identify and leap over the obstacles that are in the way of the vision. If all of us get aligned on the vision for how we want our communities to look, how we want these places to feel, then anything that gets in the way, we can just think of, all right, maybe we tweak that. What building, fire, street, or other codes obstruct them? Are they for fire life safety? Is this something that keeps people safe, happy, healthy, alive? If it's not, maybe we can tweak it. I think more street trees, for example, are a great way to keep people healthy and happy alongside the side of the road. And cars may hit them. Well, in the street, add some bulb outs, give a little curvature. Now cars are going slower and they're not as much of a danger to the trees. I don't know that you need to eliminate red tape, but I do think a good spring cleaning would help for the right kind of communities that we want to have. It's moderate, it's slight, it's little things that gradually unlock stuff. I was fortunate to have in grad school a professor named Donald Spivak, who used to work for the Los Angeles Redevelopment Agency. And they literally had a one small tweak change the whole city, like a BuzzFeed article headline. In downtown, in the old bank district in Los Angeles, they were having trouble renovating and updating a lot of the old bank and office buildings. What they found was it was parking. New codes and lenders required parking for all these building restorations. How do you turn office into condo without adding new parking under modern codes? Well, guess what? The whole area is built out. We can't add more parking. So the Los Angeles Redevelopment Agency was able to use a public parking garage and give spaces in that garage to each development nearby to meet their parking requirements. Effectively one big shared garage. That single change led to an explosion of development and conversions inside of downtown Los Angeles. And that was true there. I don't know if that's true here. But I do think surprisingly few codes are often in the way of the kind of community you want to see. It does take a little bit of stumbling sometimes and experimentation to find them, but over time you'll find that maybe 3 to 5 codes ended up having a much greater impact than 20 or 30 or 40. And I don't know that that applies to state legislation, but I do know we've been passing a lot of legislation for many years, and we're still kind of confronting the problem. The good thing, though, is that we're experimenting, we're trying. I think the same thing is true in your city. Just see what little tweaks end up getting you where you want to go. And the good thing over time is that you'll build momentum. Super blocks in Barcelona started like this: car tires and pallets and chalk. And over time, they've evolved into an amazing, refined urban product, something that the city is delivering as great public space for the residents. And I think we've all seen parklets. Parklets are an example of a product that we've all accepted is actually a good thing inside of a city. We know how to do it. We know how to take street parking and turn it into a public space. I think there are a lot of other examples like that. Parklets, super blocks, car-free neighborhoods. I think we're building a whole new repertoire of things that we can bring to our cities to make them much more exciting and vibrant for the people who live in them. I don't have time today to talk about financing. There's a whole lot behind that, especially from the private sector. But I will flag that you often find it's not just cities, not just residents, not just other people, it's not just cultural attitudes. It can often be lenders who hold back some of the change here, which totally get. If I was putting $50 million into a project and I heard they were trying something new that people didn't know much about, I would be worried as well. But there are a lot of tools that are available to get financing on board for projects like this, whether it's government or private sector, both of which can be risk averse and maybe not so open to the word experiment. I think what you generally do when you're in those conversations, just a little thing I can say is frame it as small tweaks to a traditional model. Show them the data. We counted parking garage utilization inside of Tempe, going through at peak times where cars would all be in the garages, and we shared that data openly with them, along with photos and other records. And that was a helpful way to say, hey, look, we're overbuilding parking in the area. And then we counted how people moved. We looked at new apartment complexes that had opened nearby that had overbuilt parking, and we looked at how the residents got around. We found in some cases, people were 40 to 50% getting around by car-free means already. And so what we would tell lenders is, we're just capturing that market that isn't being catered to. We're actually gonna spend less money on that stuff that no one says, oh, I'm gonna move into this apartment complex because it has an amazing parking garage. I really love the way the concrete columns just like stretch from the floor to the ceiling and everything's sort of like dark and dungeon-like. No, we're actually gonna build parks and retail and things that people will pay more in rent for, which is actually a better investment, better use of your money. So another day, we can talk more about the minutia of that. But just to leave things on a positive note, I think it's really about dreaming of what some vacant space, of what intersections, of what your city environments could become. A dream turns into a vision, turns into a conversation. And I've generally seen those things, as you all are finding here in Petaluma, they create their own momentum. And then before you know it, you have amazing safe street projects popping up around town, and parking requirements are slowly dropping, and new kinds of products are coming online. And give it some years, and you'll be seeing car light or even car-free neighborhoods of your own coming around. So I'm excited to follow the conversation here in Petaluma for a long time to come. I think there's some really exciting things happening here already, and there's only more of that to come. So thank you all for having me here today.
So we'd like to get questions on the mic so that we can get them on the Zoom recording. And if you actually want to kill the screen share, then we will go back to this little camera, which will get some of these things on camera. And let's see how long my cables are today. We might have to get people up.
John, if I come, you can come forward. Did I see your hand there? Okay.
Thank you for mentioning Santa Monica. That's where I grew up, and I actually saw the first iteration. I actually worked at Penny's on that mall
No way.
when it was there, when it was first iteration. And within 5 years, it turned from a beautiful little mall into a homeless camp. The first iteration.
The first iteration, right?
First iteration.
This is why you do your research before presentations. There's always someone in the crowd who knows more than you.
Yes. So as you said, but it's converted now. I understand it's much better now.
Yeah.
Because of '89, they reconfigured, but that was like their third iteration. They tried several things in between. So it's good to know that
Yeah.
trial and error on some of these
It
things, it's what it is, and then you got to go through some of this process. So there's some pitfalls you have to watch out for, which is good that you're doing this. So one of the things that I look at is when I get on a plane, I look down in the city and I'm looking at the movement of what's going on. And there's a huge amount of like little anthills, all these little ant trails going in and out of these cities. So what you have is a people, and you have spaces, and then the people are going to where they are working. However, they also need all these services, products, consumer goods, pharmacies, all these services. So basically they have to leave to go get the services, but trying to bring a, let's say, a hospice worker in that's going to be working with me. I'm a little old. How they come find me in that neighborhood because they have to drive from another city or get there somehow. So it's not just them leaving and going there, but you have to, a lot of folks have to come to the place, as well as goods have to come to the place to be used. So that's where I get concerned, is the distribution network of all the goods and services in and out. And how do you actually solve for that in this designs? Because that's never really talked about.
Yeah, no, I really appreciate you bringing that up. If we went in more detail on the site plan, you would notice the western side of the neighborhood is actually a parking lot. I have railed against surface parking lots. There's a surface parking lot at cul-de-sac Tempe. It's nice though, I swear. It's decomposed granite, it's pavers, it's got trees over top. I know I said parking lots aren't pretty, this one kind of is. But it's for visitors. It's for distribution, logistics. It is for the retailers. So yes, the car-free neighborhood did build retail parking and guest parking and logistics drop-off, but it was a much smaller amount. I think actually you can find online, there are plans for the project that was proposed and approved right before cul-de-sac Tempe wasn't built. It had something around 1,300 parking spaces, 1,300. Cul-de-sac Tempe has just under 200. So it's not about eliminating it altogether. You absolutely need the visitor parking. You absolutely need the guest parking. Light rail and Lyft and Uber and all those other things won't do it alone. But ideally, you just need much less parking than you would otherwise have. And that can be the unlock. And that's why right sizing is important. You absolutely should be having the conversation about how much shared parking, visitor parking, and other things you need. And it's going to look different. Not everyone can find land right against a light rail. If you do, ooh, that's an ideal opportunity. But the further you are from those kind of core amenities, the more parking you need, whether for residents or other services.
Yes, actually, I was going to ask pretty much the same question, but phrase it in a different way. Is when you're looking at the project, how do you map those connections with how people are going to move in and out? I mean, if you're prophesying a certain number of connections, so do you look at that map?
Yes, you do. And the fortunate thing is neighborhoods like this, whether retrofitting or building anew, you all create around a hub. It's a transportation and retail hub. This is where your train is. This is where your bus stop is. This is where the easiest access road is. You center all your retail on that, and you put in a drive-in right by your retail and your public plaza. That drive-in takes you into a tucked parking lot that's hidden, so it's not the face of the thing. But when all of those mobility services, vehicles, trains, buses, bikes, scooters, everything else, when they're all concentrated in one area, that's the perfect place to put a restaurant or a grocery store or a coffee shop or other stuff like that. So the nice thing about this kind of work is it always starts at a center place. And those often emerge fairly naturally. For us, it was a light rail station. It didn't take much thought. And in your own community, you'll often find there's a very key node where people get around and move. That's where you center the investment. That's where you center the transportation. That's where the retail naturally pops up. And then the further you get from that, the less retail you have, the more residential you end up with. So yes, you center it all around. The more you can concentrate in one area, the better. But parking gets tucked, retail is forward. You just make sure that you have it all in one center place and things emerge pretty naturally.
Yeah, does the retail and the restaurants and that sort of thing, do they serve mainly that community, or do people come in from all over to enjoy them?
It's a retail destination model. Cul-de-sac. I think early expectations on projects like this, not just cul-de-sac but others, are that your residents will really only be about 5 to 10% of the demand for those businesses. But that's partly why this is hard. One of the reasons we build neighborhoods with single family homes and retail strip malls and office parks is all a developer has to think about is one product. All I have to know is how that home sells. All I have to know is how that strip mall works. When you have to figure out the retail component and the residential, and then you mix them, there's a little bit more math involved. So it can be tricky. And that's where you need to be very deliberate that you have the right team in place to deliver great retail environments and great residential environments at the same time. And there's a lot that goes into that. It's how you face and front them. It's how the signage works. As John mentioned, thank you for coming, by the way, as one of our elected leaders in Petaluma. as you mentioned in Santa Monica, you get a few things wrong, you end up with the opposite. So you need to be very thoughtful. But we were fortunate to work with an amazing local small developer, retail programmer named Lorenzo Perez, who, if you've heard of Jim Hyde, who runs the small development toolkit and community up in Healdsburg.
Yeah, Jim spoke here in the fall, I believe.
Amazing. Well, perfect. So Jim Hyde and Lorenzo Perez are great friends. And Lorenzo is actually how I met Jim. But he helped us with our retail program. He helped us understand where things could fit, how they should be laid out. It doesn't need to be a whole nother development partner. Maybe it could just be an advisor who understands the fine art of curating a retail community.
I was wondering what advice you might have for getting local business owners on board with, for instance, like a street pedestrianization project.
Yes, that can be one of the harder things. A lot of businesses are formed on how many people can I flow through on vehicles. And what I've found is that the slow and steady approach, it's a parklet, then it's an intersection, and maybe it's a weekend, then it's weekdays. You kind of let the results speak for themselves. And I've heard there's maybe a little bit of that action going on already. One of the reasons those pop-up projects, a day, an intersection, a street, works is that if it's truly not something the area want, all right, well, didn't land, people don't want it, businesses don't want it. If it's something that does work, it takes off. And then you start asking people, so, how many more customers did you have on Saturday when we shut the street down? Huh, I wonder if it was like that all the time. That'd be interesting. Well, someone should try it. Before you know it, these things start to naturally propagate. And then if you have the relationships and the close connection, sometimes people just need to visualize it. We had a lot of success with virtual reality goggles, just showing the model of the community to people, because people were having trouble picturing this environment. And as soon as they stepped into the model, they're like, oh, this is actually very nice. This makes a lot of sense. Taking people on tours of other places. If there's a key business member who maybe doesn't get it, but is willing to talk, can we go down a street that has less parking, fewer cars, but actually is doing very well somewhere nearby or somewhere in San Francisco? Sometimes just feeling it helps people get on board. But if it's working organically, that's the best message. And you don't need to push it. You don't need to force it. You just drop hints. Ooh, this seems to be working. I wonder if you have more customers like this. That might be great.
Hi, I'm Morgan. I lived in car-free about half a mile from cul-de-sac, Tempe,
No way.
for about 20 years before cul-de-sac launched.
Oh, bummer.
In one of the dorms. Yeah, no, definitely a bummer. But I bring that up because maybe 10% of the students there had cars, but I think that a different kind of momentum would be to kind of show people that they can live this way. And a lot of folks who choose to live on campus during college have lived this way. I mean, I'm here advocating for it now, and I
Right.
think Arizona State has a lot of satellite campuses, but I don't think they'll launch one in Petaluma anytime soon. But what we can do is do stuff like connect SRJC, the Petaluma campus,
Yeah.
with transit, just to show people that it's possible to live here without actually having to build a massive project, right?
No, I think that's exactly right. You make a great point that if you think of cul-de-sac as a bunch of ingredients, we had the advantage of putting all those ingredients together at once. We were baking the whole cake from scratch. But those same ingredients can work here. Maybe you have the retail. Maybe you have the nice homes. Maybe you have all of it. You just don't have a transit station. Well, does adding a bus stop to that area completely change the whole dynamic? There can be things like that already. And we talked a lot on all the projects I've worked on about how we all kind of love college and we feel so nostalgic about it. But if you really think about it, it's one of the few times we live generally car-free and close to friends and near retail. It's one of the few times in our lives we can do that. What if we bring the college campus environment back? That could be a lot of fun. But the good thing is that, to your exact point, like, these are just ingredients. Like, figure out what's missing in your cake and just add those components and you're good to go. You don't need to overhaul everything or build something new. Just add what's missing and see what happens.
Come on, it's gotta be somebody else here. Really?
Thank you, Dave. I'm curious what the demand for cul-de-sac was like, and if there was a profile of people that chose to live there. Were they Tempe locals, or did people move there to live that lifestyle?
Yeah, so at some point it could be interesting to talk with Ryan, CEO of Cul-de-sac, and we can talk about that, Dave. But he'll have the best insight into where that's at now. What I do know is there was a lot of demand, somewhere in the range of 2 to 3 more in terms of leasing pace the nearby apartments, there was a long wait list. The wait list was actually thousands of people long. And that was partly what we used to get the financing for the project down the road, that we were like, okay, look, we understand, we can't fill a few hundred apartments, but look at this wait list of 2,000 people. And also look at how parking really is utilized to provide. And people kind of already live car free. But all those ingredients together made a lot of sense. And they talk about this in a lot of the news articles about the project, but it was people from all over. One of my favorite guys, Bob, was a retired professor from the Pacific Northwest. He moved to Arizona just a little bit early for a first shot at the neighborhood, and we'd take him on regular tours of his unit as we were building it. But it was something that was drawing people all over. We saw people from San Francisco, from New York, primarily, actually, and then folks from just everywhere in between. I think there's even some from Alaska, who are all interested in trying to live this way. And the kind of coordinated vision is what attracted them. That you could maybe pick a place to live like this, but A, you wouldn't be able to rent an apartment for less than $2,000 a month in those kind of places. And B, like there wasn't that shared vision that we're all trying to do this. I think we actually have, oh shoot, I have not been looking at the chat. Okay.
So from the chat, Joe asks, how small of an area would be needed to start a community like this? What would the differences be with a smaller area to start with?
That's a really good question. I think some of it comes down to the gumption of the residents. If you're willing to bike and hustle and hike everywhere, you can figure it out in a homestead. But I think when you want it to happen organically, you do need, I think, somewhere in the range of a couple thousand people in the area who can support the retail. And you need a few dozen people in the community itself that can sustain actually building the amenities and the other features. When you're building from scratch, that is, you need just enough people to actually be able to build some of the retail, build some of the courtyard amenities. Just one home is not really enough to change the whole dynamic. And you need what they call kind of like a customer shed of people who will go by the grocery store, go by the restaurant. We were actually fortunate in this area. It was a bit of a food desert, so a grocery store was needed, and it fit in perfectly with that environment. But I mean, as you're doing this in places that already exist, you can think of it as an advantage. You already have ingredients nearby. Maybe you already have nice local retail, and there's maybe a gap you're filling. Maybe there's a grocery store, but there's not maybe a medical space. Maybe you're missing some of the smaller features you need. Maybe there's like you're missing a laundromat, or you're missing a thrift store, or even just like a podiatrist or something else. Let's see what gaps there are to fill in. Maybe it's also that you have enough residents, you just don't have enough of the transit. How do we bring that? Maybe you have a transit station that doesn't have enough people around it, in which case build the apartments, build away. I think you can figure it out in a lot of different shapes and sizes, but you generally need a core of residents who are living that way. There to be some shared community and shared amenities. Something between 30 and 50, I think, is a good number. You need good retail nearby. Definitely the grocery store has to be in walking distance. No questions on that. A slew of little retail around that as well. And then you need the transportation and the transit. So however you can figure that out, I think you'll start to see these things thrive. But that's where in existing environments, it can be fun to experiment and just kind of see if we change little things here and there, do we see an uptick in people living car free? Do we add a bus station at a campus and all of a sudden see a lot more people using it? Okay, head in the right direction. Let's do more of that.
Yeah, I suspect that this is particularly, I don't know how far your walking tour got, but we have the vacant areas between the station and downtown, and then a massive, well, the parking lot is used a lot on Friday nights, but we have a big low-level strip mall that.
Yeah. So one comment I'll add to that. I was fortunate where I lived in Tempe. I was just south of University, in a neighborhood called University Park. And there was a road called College Avenue. Very aptly named. This was a transit spine. So it was actually a way that people got straight to the university, but it was also a way that people got to the streetcar that was there. So if there's one kind of spine road that's safe for bikers, walkers, maybe there's even a bus route on it, that is a fantastic sort of like stream to take people to the river that is the smart station. And when those kind of connector roads emerge, you'll see those kind of car-free neighborhoods pop up along them, or you'll see car-free residents pop up along them. You just give people those resources. It doesn't need to be a bus that goes through every single street, rivets around. Just a single kind of stream that connects to the main river of transit can be really effective. And I think we were fortunate that living on the light rail station, was that natural river already. But there are ways to add that or even implement it nearby existing rail. And I'm sure you're already thinking of many of those connector streets, but those connector streets can be really the root system for the trees of the neighborhoods to grow.
Public engagement. How did you engage with the neighbors as you were beginning your planning process? And assuming some residual resistance remained, how did you handle the official public meetings?
So I've worked in California, and I've worked in Arizona. Two very different environments for community. Just the way it is. I think there's a lot more hesitance towards adding new housing in California. There are a lot more tools to resist it. It's just the way it is. Sometimes it's because the project's not right. Sometimes the project's right. It's just not landing. So I want to caveat that projects get permitted in 8 to 12 months in Arizona, and then they're starting construction 6 to 12 months later. No environmental review. There is still community engagement. There's public processes. There's all sorts of stuff like that, but it's a very different environment. What we did find through the community engagement process, and I've seen this land elsewhere, there were some incredible messages from this. Hey, we're bringing a grocery store to this neighborhood. Awesome. Here's what the grocery store is going to look like. Here's the grocer himself to talk to you about what he's going to bring to this community. That went over so well. As much as I love people, I recognize that just bringing apartments and just bringing homes does not always resonate with nearby neighbors. You can't really meet those people, right? They're just kind of faceless. Often, we were talking about this before. Finella was saying, people sometimes aptly just think of new residents as new cars. But that's the second point. Not building much parking. Guess what you're not bringing nearby? We're going to bring a grocery store, and we're not going to bring new congestion. All right, now you're getting somewhere. And also look at the buildings. They're going to be pretty. And we're going to have open space that you can venture into, and a public plaza, and a little parkland area, and other small retail. And so the community engagement actually went extraordinarily well. People were fans of the project who were actively protesting other apartment complex just a half mile away. And in a lot of ways, it was great retail. It looked good, and it wasn't bringing in congestion. And they thought the policies that were put in place were just right. The transportation plan was just right to make sure that happened. But again, that was Arizona. Whatever you do in you so much as move a muscle on some kind of development in California, you will attract some residual anger or resentment in some way, shape, or form. But I think the more that you're able to communicate, wait a second, we're not bringing as much congestion. We're bringing some good things for the neighborhood. It's going to look better. It's going to fit in. The more that, hopefully that message lands more. Then, as much as I love apartments, some of them can just be a block of units with people you don't know yet, with a splashing of colors and maybe a parking garage in the back. Like, it's actually kind of hard to pitch that to people in a neighborhood about what that is going to add to their day-to-day life. So the good thing about these neighborhoods is they have good things that you can pitch to the people nearby.
We have another from the chat room. Rachel asks, could Anders talk a little bit more about the demographics of cul-de-sac? Age, spread of residents, how many commuters work elsewhere, how many remote workers? Are there any light industry occupancies? As we saw at the film festival, which we held a few weeks ago, the breweries, bike manufacturing, textiles, that kind of thing.
Yeah, so have to be careful talking about the residences of any of the communities I've worked on from LA to elsewhere, just because of FHA, Fair Housing Act, and other stuff. What I can say is that in communities like this that I've lived in or experienced or built, they're amazingly diverse. You're building multi-generational courtyards, and they tend to organically attract multi-generational folks. You see people who have retired and want to downsize and don't want to drive anymore, can't drive anymore. Like, this is perfect. Everything I need is nearby. I've actually heard a lot of criticism about projects of mine because people think that not having a car is bad for people who may have some kind of physical challenge or something else like that. But what I've found from actual conversations with people who need a van to get around, if they're able to get around at all, this is actually an ideal kind of community. Flat, flush surfaces that you can take to a lot of your basic needs. This is actually a great environment for people who may have physical challenges. And then you go down to the youth side. I mean, young people want to be around each other. Melissa, we were talking about this before. Where's the single dating scene, right? if you're stuck in cars everywhere, singles want to mingle. It's the way it is. So you see a lot of that happening out here. These communities kind of naturally attract a wide range. I do want to clarify one thing. What was meant by light industry? Could we ask, or do you know maybe?
Well, in the particular, she references breweries. Petaluma has a couple of breweries. I think there was like a cargo bike manufacturer highlighted in one of the film festival films. Generally, they're kind of craft. I think, it's high-end, low volume product kind of stuff.
Yeah.
Maker, yeah, there's a term that's come up in zoning
Totally.
discussion recently.
So I think maker spaces are one of the most natural human things. Like these are things that just pop up anywhere you have two features: an easy, flexible space, affordable rent. What we found at Cul-de-sac Tempe, and you can read about this more online too, but the micro retail spaces, simple 500 or 600 square foot spaces that you could rent for just over $1,000 a month, just got swallowed up almost instantly by thrift shops and pedicurists and yoga studios and candle makers and sellers and jewelry makers and all sorts of little knickknack businesses. We were talking about it before, Kevin, but we were kind of saying these are like the home businesses, like the home restaurant, or the person just kind of putting their product together on their living room counter. They don't want to go through a whole tenant improvement process that costs tens of thousands of dollars, try to meet fire code, and open a business in a 3,000 square foot space. That's insane. I work on fire code renovations and other things like that as a full-time job. I get a headache from some of those things. How does someone who just wants to make candles try to become a developer just to open a business? And these were spaces that were actually built out to kind of be like apartments. So they had everything they needed. The best way I've come to think of it is that if someone can move into the space in a weekend, they sign a lease on Friday, they're opening the business on Monday, and they're paying less than like $2,000 a month for it. It's not square foot price. It's not anything else. It's just aggregate price. You'll see a lot of businesses just pop into those environments. Now, is it hard to get there? Yes. But if it's done right, do you see a lot of those maker studios just naturally pop up? You do. And I think, so this was a new build, right? So light industry, I think often ends up happening in older buildings. But the reason I would say that happens is if those older buildings are more affordable, if someone doesn't have a use for them, you somehow figure out how to get them a certificate of occupancy meeting modern code, and you're able to subdivide the spaces. People just kind of naturally soak that up. So I would say the more that you're doing those two things, flexible, easy open, and affordable, you'll just see that natural human creation ability take hold.
Anybody? Matthew.
Something in particular, we have a big problem with housing affordability here in California, as you probably recognize, partially because we haven't delivered enough housing, and partially because the housing we deliver isn't of the scale to actually suit most people. The houses are oversized. So I'm curious about the unit mix at Tempe, and particularly about the income levels of people who are able to afford them.
Yeah, so I mean, you can look online. You'll see the unit mix, and you'll see the rent levels online. But it's 1,500 to 3,000 an apartment, ones, twos, threes, mostly one bedrooms. All this information you can actually find on the Cul-de-sac Tempe Zillow. Fairly affordable to the region. It's within that. And just above the federal definition of workforce housing, just above that, even though it's a market rate apartment complex. And unit mixes are such a tricky thing. I've never gotten that right on projects going all the way back to my public housing days. There's always a tension between what people want to finance and what people in the community want. Always a tension. I've tried to build public housing where the community wants 4 and 5 bedrooms because it's a lot of families who want to share an environment, and the developers and lenders are like, I'm only giving you 2s and 3s, man. And there's always a tension there. It can be tricky to solve. I think the more that you're able to have real conversations with people on the ground, the more that you're able to see how people are actually living. We were talking a bit about this before, but when you look at like how many people are cramming into a house in a normal neighborhood, you look at how many cars are parked outside, you look at how many trash cans filling up some of the spaces, you get a sense for what people need in the community. And I think I'm seeing more folks really wanting maybe the larger bedroom sizes, that they want that home office. They want to have a room for a friend as a roommate or a relative. 3 and 4 bedrooms are actually becoming much more popular in terms of lease up rate, and also in terms of just what people are asking for. But I mean, depending on your environment, with the median income in this area, 1 bedrooms probably fly off the shelves, especially with your proximity to San Francisco. So there's that tension where, okay, maybe 1 bedrooms are flying off the shelves, and that's what financiers will put up money for, but you're hearing from the community, we need some more 3s or 4s.
What I would recommend then is trying different products. There's actually a guy in SoCal who does this so well. His name is Scott. I believe it's Chopin, maybe Chopin, Chopin. Sorry, Scott, if I butchered pronunciation of that. He builds what are called workforce townhomes. So they're 3, 4, 5 bedroom, larger units made for families. They can be built attached. They can be built separate. There's a lot of ways to build those affordably, but densely. And he's figured that out really nicely in Southern California, Scott, Chopin. So this can be a tricky question, but there's a mix of like, let's build what we can because we can finance it. And then there's also, let's try some new products that cater to what people need in the community. On incomes, that's another FHA thing where you really can't talk about that in the communities you've built. But I think generally, when building projects like this, things tend to match the surrounding community. I think a lot of this demand is fairly present across wide swaths of ages and classes. And so they end up being fairly working class and middle class. What's interesting is the more money you have, the more I think people end up buying things that isolate themselves. I don't know if that's healthy for us as humans. I don't know if that's what I want, but I think the more you tend to see the incomes rise, the more people tend to buy the gated community, maybe the penthouse with maybe its own elevator, but these walkable car-free communities, if you build them affordably with the right product type, they're kind of for everyone. They're really maybe one of the last bastions of where middle-class folks can live.
Hi, so I have a question. So cul-de-sac is all rental apartments,
All
right?
rental.
Would this model work in condo purchase?
I think it absolutely could. Generally, when I've seen people request for sale product around this, they usually want at least one parking space. Maybe it's a small garage tucked in the back. Maybe it's a space in the parking lot somewheres away. But the question I heard most when giving tours at Cul-de-sac Tempe, or even when working on projects like this around, is how do we make this for sale? So I think there's a ton of demand for it. And just figuring out the right amount of parking for people in the area is key. But I do think that you can build for sale with a smaller amount of parking and still see people love it. If you build this in the right area, and someone just has a small garage, there are a lot of ways you can fit a 1-car garage into a really nice townhome or even condo floor plan that can fit well with communal areas. It's the 2 or the 3-car garages and then the street parking and the long driveway that really starts to soak up area. But one garage, a little back alley, those things you can fit into an urban plan. You want to get the mic?
Sure, let's do that.
Can you build these kind of communities without public transit? Because if that's a part of the process that's harder to organize.
That's a really good question. Leave it to my fiance to ask a stumper. I would not say that I've seen projects like this work without public transit. They're just such a vital part of moving people around an environment. I'm thinking maybe if you're like Davis, California, if you're like Amsterdam, where you have hordes of bicyclists around, you can figure it out. Like if instead of like car congestion, you have bike congestion, okay, maybe you don't need public transit. But unfortunately, places where bicyclists thrive like that are unicorns. I mean, Davis has like the highest mode share for bikes in the country. Amsterdam, there's really only one of them. Public transit, Copenhagen. Okay, very good, very fair point. Copenhagen, yeah, you're right. Copenhagenize, master the bike lane. There aren't too many of them, and I think they tend to be more high education and like Danish, like Dutch, right? Go figure. So I do think public transit is going to be necessary unless you know for a fact that you have tons of bicyclists or you've got people who are really into speed walking in the area. Like unless there's another dominant share, you're going to need public transit.
I would just ask the notes that a couple of project types you've mentioned, we do have local examples, just for the benefit, not of you, but for the audience.
Yeah.
Oyster Cove would have been a townhome. It may still be, hopefully it will be, a 3-story townhome project for sale with a 1-car garage. Yeah, I know. It's stalled right now, and it's a half block from the train station. So pretty seriously cool. And huge park next to it. Absolutely. Thank you, Brenda. And then 5400 Old Redwood Highway, which many of you know is the old Adobe lumber building, the one that's currently going through a discussion about incorporation of the city. That is probably the perfect maker space in town. A lot of empty space, existing building, cool building. So we do have some of these things already. We need to do more of it, but we're not completely bereft.
Okay, so I'm gonna add on to that. This is slightly self-serving as a developer. Don't mind it. You can decide what you want to do with it. It's very easy to say no. Always easier to be like, I don't want that. It's easy to type. It's easy to say into a mic. It's hard to say yes. It's hard to put yourself out there and be like, this thing is going to be new and different, but I think it's going to work. So if it's possible, help a developer friend out and invite those folks maybe to come speak. And if you think the project's good and worthwhile, maybe go to a city council meeting and be like, hey, this should happen. I support it. Lord knows they're going to get a ton of opposition no matter what they do. Having some people go up there and maybe help some folks here out and say, yes, we like it. It's good for these reasons. Make it happen, folks. That goes a long way because absolutely public opposition can stall these things. I don't know if you already do that. I hope you do, but
You know, and to be fair, for Oyster Cove, yes, we had a lot of people in this room show up to argue that's a good
Amazing.
project. So yes.
exactly right. Now, I'm not saying do it willy-nilly. Don't just support every project. There are developers out there who are bad nuts. Totally get it. But if you can find developers you like and projects you can stand behind, ooh, the more that you can, say yes and be a part of the public push to make that happen. Financing and economic headwinds, they're all part of this too, but being public voices to say this is what we want in our community can go such a long way.
Speaking of which, the second reading of the overlay will be on the council agenda Monday evening. There is a push to get enough, what we hear is only the negatives show up at most council meetings, and then we have everyone who's speaking saying, look, everyone in the room is opposing it. Why is the council in favor of it? If you can make an effort to be at Monday evening's meeting, if you are in support of the overlay, either way, if people in this room who are more aware of land use issues than most people in this community can show up Monday evening and put a vote in for whatever you think is right, that helps raise the level of the conversation.
And bring a friend or a relative.
Thank you. Anybody else? Are you, I've got one here. And Brand, I'll get you next. You bet. I saw you first. You're lucky.
How long did you say it took from like the very concept to people moving in, and how far from like the town already, development that's already there is it? Is it off on its own, or is it like abutting the town?
Yeah, great question. So I'll answer the second one first. It's only about 1.5 miles from Arizona State. It's on a light rail station, 10 minutes by light rail to downtown Tempe and ASU, 15-20 minutes to Mesa, to the east, 30-40 to the airport, Phoenix to the west, quite central. But I'm still 1.5 miles. That's a 30-minute walk, right? That's a 7-8 minute bike ride, depending on how fast you're pedaling. Still a good distance. I think you do find that from a transit center or an economic center, there is about maybe 20 to 40 minutes in terms of walk time where you can fit projects like this nicely. And if there's, a transit station there, boom, you're off to the races. So it is quite central, definitely integrated within the urban fabric. On timeline, the vision and all that stuff came about. I think the project was announced in the Wall Street Journal in 2019, and then COVID hit, and then construction stuff went insane. So the community opened in early 2023. So call it a few years and change. Love developers, never trust their timelines. These things move and shift and change. Even building parks back in Metro Detroit, these things are all over the place. But you got to have an optimistic target. I think the beautiful thing about this, you see this sometimes when you read about monuments, great churches, amazing public work projects. Many of them took decades to finish. Sometimes it took a few kings just to finish one of these big churches. But no one thinks of that now when they look at it. It's hard in the moment. Ooh, it hurts when you're trying to stay on schedule. But down the road, people see it and they like it and they love it. It's worth the time. And, a few years is actually a short time in the broad span of things. And the more that time passes, the more you're like, oh, that was quick. That was fine. That was acceptable. So the time, I think the time is almost always worth it.
Hi. So you mentioned the ability of school-age children to walk safely to school from cul-de-sac. And so my curious question is whether or not families with school-age children in that development feed schools that were already existing, or whether or not schools had to be planned based on the enrollment numbers.
Great question. So no new schools added here. There are actually some of the recent articles have actually covered families who live in the neighborhood. So some of the recent ones, I think the Dwell article on cul-de-sac Tempe actually covers a family who lives there. But I actually volunteered at a community garden by the elementary school that was 2 blocks north, nestled in the neighborhood, just around the corner from there. There was another high school, maybe a mile or 2 west in biking distance. So there were a lot of schools already around, which it was, again, it was central enough that it was near a lot of that stuff. Part of the reason, my ambitions, my work now is taking me to building at larger scales. Part of that was wanting to be a part of developing schools intertwined with great roads, intertwined with great neighborhoods. There's a lot that you can do when you're planning all of those ingredients together at once, make for a great environment. But the more that you can find those special nooks interwoven with transit, and schools, and retail, the more that you've got a great place to try to pull things off like this. Why you want infill?
One more on one.
There again.
So Joe again in the chat asks, is urban permaculture related to your approach? What do you think of integrating professionally run food gardens into these types of developments?
Absolutely support it, love it, advocate for it. As a former urban farmer, all about it. One of my first projects actually. So I was a creative writing and math major in undergrad, and I was trying to be a novelist, maybe a physicist, maybe a novelist. Couldn't decide. You know how college is. I stumbled across this work growing up in a city called Pontiac, that very similar to Detroit, had a lot of economic struggles after the car boom turned into a slump, and then GM was casually laying off tens of thousands of people overnight in condensed neighborhoods, and that sucked. So there was a lot of work to do in these neighborhoods to just revive them into a livable state. So I ended up with some friends and other nonprofits working on large swaths of vacant land, and we would just start small, build a park, plant an orchard, plant a bigger orchard, start inoculating logs with mushrooms, and before you know it, you have a whole hydroponic system to feed the orchard, and you're renovating homes nearby for farm workers. Absolutely a fan of urban permaculture. I think it's a great way to just get things started. And what you can actually find is, I like that you mentioned professionally run. I have tried community run, community gardens, and a little bit too decentralized. People think they like gardens until they realize they don't have a green thumb and things are dying, and then they give up. So it's good to have a professional or people who know what they're doing active in it. And the more that you can fit these into communities or nearby, the more that people can really appreciate it. But having a community-run garden with some professionals just north of cul-de-sac Tempe, it was great for me working on it and being near it. Great for the residents as well. Fully support them being integrated. I don't yet know how you create those professional networks from scratch. I've mostly stumbled across those experts and then clung to them because I have the brownest thumb you can imagine. I really struggle to keep things alive. But the more that you can find that and promote it, the better.
And hopefully, last question here, just to kind of wrap things up a little bit. We seem to be on the innovation phase of the tipping point of where we need to go and do. And innovation, a lot of folks have come in, sounds like a lot of innovation people joined in. And so now in other places, these are happening, popping up a little bit here and there in the energy. So we're in the innovation stage, and there's a future tipping point we want to achieve, at least 15% population doing this. So how do we, is there any examples other than Copenhagen? Is there any, do you see energy, and do you see where folks are getting the interest? Where do we go from here into that next phase? I mean, as national basis. So where are we there, and how many folks are working on this? And is this a pattern you see as reaching an actual tipping point where we actually start doing a full conversion?
Yeah, great question. And I think we're getting very close. I don't know if anyone follows this nationally, but Cambridge, Massachusetts just upzoned the entire city, changed parking requirements, completely overhauled how things work. It was just a wish list of things that they incorporated into their code. They're landlocked. They're very dense, but you're starting to see the movement behind this. I mentioned Boston in these slides. I've seen LA work on this. I used to live in the Echo Park area. We've got some great projects that are pushing forward out there. And one of the things I love about Northern California, I think is going to help it reach a tipping point like this, we have some amazing downtowns up here. They're often centered on a plaza. A lot of them already have great activity and great development work. If those are the nodes, I mean, downtown Petaluma is absolutely phenomenal. The smart station and the projects you have growing up there. The more that those become the nodes that a lot of this work is centered around, the more that we may start to hit those tipping points inside of our own cities. And I think this is really a movement that it's probably only around the 5 to 10% range right now. I think we're probably a few years off from really tipping over. I think there are enough people talking about this and trying this. I mean, you see states do bold things. I think, if I have it right, don't quote me, but I think the entire state of Oregon tried to upzone with duplexes. Minneapolis, Minnesota, outlawed single-family zoning and has been changing a lot of parking requirements. I'm seeing more and more cities, counties, states, people trying things like this. To your point, I think it is interesting. We're at a phase where regulations are changing, but we're not necessarily seeing the fruit of all that yet. It's going to take some time. The regulations changing today probably means, fruit on the vine with new developments 3 or 4 years from now. So I'm hopeful though that maybe, within the next decade, we'll probably be hitting a tipping point in certain cities and certain regions. We'll have a lot of great examples to show people, hey, look at this road that they followed, it worked. But last thing I'll say on this, Barcelona took a long time. They've been working on Superblock since 2016. Many people were working on it for many years before that. It's kind of an unpredictable road. It's uncertain, but it's worthwhile.
It has gotten to be 8:30. Anders Egnell, you did a marvelous job. I love the presentation. Dan, we need to get this video up online as soon as possible. Thumbs up from there. Thank you for making the trip over from Vacaville. Thank you for bringing your lovely fiance along, and it was a great evening.
Thank
Everyone
you,
who's here,
everyone.
thank you.